Hello everyone, Kurt Olfer here, and welcome back to another episode from Homefitter Labs. Today we're continuing on in regards to our armor considerations about what's being worn and some of the observations that come from that when you talk about arms that are suspended on the belt in arming systems. Today we're going to be talking about specifically on how the functionality of a long arm works in conjunct with these sidearms. And again, one of the reasons why rotational attributes and aspects may be applicable. Now, we're not into the axe or the lance section yet. However, we are going to get there. And before we get to this, I figured it might be a good idea to centrally locate all these videos now, to the here and now, so that we can look at this at a point in time here and call back to it. I figure these are all considerations when it comes down to an armiger, one who wears armor, who bears armor, to know what effects are there against us, so that we can ensure to make sure what works for us. Before we get into this, please, if you haven't already, like, subscribe, share with a friend out there. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm very curious about what people have to say about this. And if you're new to the channel, please join us for this journey. We really want to have as many people as we possibly can for this, and that's not possible without viewers like you. So please, join us and observe what we got here for Fiore's Armaments Art. With that being the case here, let's take a look here about how with long arms, i.e. the pole and the axe, some other factors that may be limiting to us when we talk about other suspension system concepts like the scabbarded sword and dagger in armor are affected.
So now we're going to be talking about some long arm considerations that may or may not be thought about here, especially wearing in conjunction of arms and worn swords. The big thing we're going to be talking about here again is the poleaxe as well as the lanza. And mind you, there are various different ways that these things look. There's various different ways that they function. There's different ways that they're built. People did different things for different portions of these weapons. In some cases, they have a spike in the butt of a poleaxe. In some cases, these wing spikes here are smaller. Sometimes this right here is a little bit different. But regardless of this right here, the point we're looking at here is how this relates in conjunction with the body. So this right here is an Arms and Armor back to Corbin. It is one of my favorite collection pieces because the fact is it really shows you how absolutely nasty this thing can be, especially when you start talking about the usage of this and how absolutely light this thing is, but horrific it is on the tip. We're going to be looking at just basic concepts right here to be considered with it. So we're going to be talking about the posta. We're not going to be talking about any of the type of technologies and things about this, but we're going to look about how this works in conjunction with the body. And again, you can see how, in this case, I have to contend with scabbard and sword, which allow for certain things to come into play. We can see here in some of the positions, again, if I'm wearing a sword, I need to make sure that I have the space in between here to use that axe to strike into different forms and functions. Another thing too about this right here is that essentially if we're coming to the other side, so if I go coat along on the left, now this is in the way. And it doesn't mean that it's going to stop, but it could mean that if I catch this behind the crossguard, that I throw my sword in the midst of a blow. Again, whether they had swords on their hips or not when it came down to this or not, I'm not 100% certain. But I think about this because of some of the depictions that we see within the lanza section where there's pictures of people bearing sword and dagger. Okay? So the usage of this right here, again, we talk about how the space right here to my left is clear. Similar concept that we had to do with the sword positions, because as I'm talking about these things, I have to be able to make sure that as the sword goes in different directions, I can shift and not lose my poleaxe, which is a big factor. If I lose my poleaxe, that's a big problem. And on top of that, if I lose my sword while trying to use my poleaxe or my dagger, that's another problem. So again, we're just looking at some of the shape concepts right here and how, again, off of this, we may have to navigate and allow certain strikes to happen because of the nature of the volta and how scabbarded and belted weapons rotate on the body. Okay? So, we talk about his fenestra. So being here, now my arms are uncrossed, and I'm in a spot where I have this is out of the way. So I can cause all sorts of mannerisms. posto di donna alla soprana, mezzo portiferro, and other situations called dente di cingaro. Every breve position, keeping it tight to the body. So the short position right here, the true cross, right? So again, what are we talking about here? Keeping the space clear so we have actions and so on and so forth. And that right there really is just the basic look at what I have here as far as for the axe. Mind you, when we get to the axe section, we'll be talking about its weights, its attributes, its features, some of the things that I have as far as my collections and whatnot, and also how power generation works in conjunction with the body, at least from my findings. But for right now, we're going to shift from the pole axe, and we're going to move into the lanza, which is the next variant that we have. Now, like I've said before in previous videos, this is not exactly a 100% accurate lanza depiction right here. It is very good for what I try to train for right here. It has a pedale on one end right here, which causes a counterbalance. Again, we'll talk about this much more later on when we start talking about this weapon in its own isolation. But for today, because we're starting to talk about armor, I think, again, it's important to look at all these things in conjunction with each other. So again, depending on how you see it, let's look at it all. On the right side, is this your tuta portiferro? Maybe. Sometimes they also depict the thought is that the spear is low. In this regard right here, it could be that as well. But regardless, again, what's happening in this space? I can position it right here, which allows actions to come across. The sword is behind me in some form or fashion. If it's in here, I run the risk of smacking it under duress. Okay? Now we can talk about the mezzo portiferro, which I believe is like this. And again, we can see how the scabbard is off to the side. My dagger's right here. Nothing is really limiting me to take immediate actions of being limiting off of for the rest of the body. Again, key components of the fighting situation. Last but not least, we have the fenestra. And this is a good example right here. I'm glad this happened because the fact of the matter is, as you're moving around, this is something that can happen. The argument of whether scabbards are, supposed to be super tight or they're loose is something that's up for debate. There was an episode from Todd's workshop where he walked across water, hung the sword out to dry in the scabbard, put the sword, and he had a hard time pulling the sword out of the scabbard. So, is it that the scabbard itself is loose or is it not? But the big thing right here is, and again, I'm glad this happened, is because as you're moving, you can start to lose arms. So coming across into this position, if I'm in my fenestra position, I want to make sure that this is tight to my body in some form or fashion, but you can tell here that it is, once again, a factor as far as rotation and movement that allows for this to go in different directions. Go in the opposite direction of this right here, so let's go back, so fenestra on the left side. And again, nothing is inhibiting anything that I'm wearing. Everything's tight to me, there's no problem with it. Easy peasy, it's right there for fighting purposes. Then to the cingaro, from this position right here, again, the lance is in the middle of my arms. So I have every ability to move across and cause different forms and factions. And finally, last but not least, vera croce. Now again, whether there's a handedness that comes down to this when it comes down to the lance, we're not necessarily sure. I think the only handedness that we really have there is it comes down to the sword and the dagger. But regardless, I'm talking about these right here as far as within the manuscript. In this case right here, the sword is not in the way of the lance to move, and I'm able to work this quite easily because there's nothing limiting in the way. So these are just, once again, some factors that talk about with long arms that can happen. And again, that the sword coming out of the scabbard is something that has happened to me in deeds, it's happened to me in training, it's happened to some sparring. Losing this right here is something that is very possible to happen, especially if you're using something and you're having to do big rotation motions. It points out a fact to me that you might want to have this a little bit higher up because that way it stays in here, it doesn't fall over and become like this. But then again, I don't necessarily know. I leave that up to you, dear viewers, to also take a look and see what you have. But this right here concludes what we're talking about here as far as, once again, how the belted systems that we have here of dagger and sword work in conjunct with longer tools of war.
So as you can see with the video, once again, we see a repeat concept of round motions, big round circular motions. And to me, I don't believe that that is a mistake. We will get further when we go further into the longer weapon positions and weapon and concepts, whatnot. We'll be doing more of a down and deep observation of what I have for each of these individual pieces. Okay, so that's all going to be possible when we look at that. But as it goes right now, looking at this in a form and fashion that allows us to be able to extrapolate further is a big part right here, because again, you have to consider what happens. Do you just want to come across because you might lock or lose your sword in some form or fashion? Coming across here, do you pull it out of its scabbard? And mind you, these are all things here that I have observed for myself, and they're important pieces that I had to experience to show that there are considerations that we probably don't know about yet. Remember, we're looking at this in the modern era as a way of saying, you know what? This is a fun activity for me to participate in. This was not a fun activity for people to participate in the time. It might have been fun to compete with one another in certain capacities, but I guarantee being an armiger, as it always is, has got its own sets of pride and whatnot as far as capabilities and being associated with. But when you actually had to make things, you had to do things like fight for real. It's not about fun, and it becomes about, it's a very, very different headspace. So being able to deploy arms, maneuver, and everything else, and knowing how these things work together so that you don't have that happen, I believe is very valuable information, especially for the historical, experimental archaeology of martial arts. So the big observations I have here, like I said before, is like with the lance, you have a lot more rotation, and it's a little bit easier to move because in my experience, the foot end, the pedale, weighs a little bit more, so it's easier to push that up and away out and to create space. That is something I observed. And mind you, that lance that's in that video, not necessarily a 100% historical replica. I did the best I could, but that's what I got for the moment. When it came to the poleaxe is another interesting piece, because now you're talking about something that may have a variety of different areas there. The weight is up higher versus lower. So when I come down with this, it becomes much more encapsulated to the body, and then all the other positions where, once again, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to avoid getting entangled with my belted equipment. And that is a very important thing, in my opinion, when it comes down to the attributes of deploying arms, is because if you don't know how it's going to entangle up what allows you to find the dagger or your sword, if your main arm is lost, then you're just wearing equipment, you're not armed. And I think that's a big part that might have been a huge consideration, especially in historical times. So with that being the case here, that's going to do it for this video right here. Again, I don't want to go too deep into this right here about these long arms, because we're going to get there eventually. But for the moment, we are talking about the aspects and attributes about, once again, what happens with the equipment that might be worn around the waist and how they work in conjunct to one another and some of the limitation factors. So, like I said, it's just the observations of what presently is observed while wearing arms. Let me know what your thoughts out there. Leave a comment below. Like I said, curious what your thoughts are. Are you asking these types of questions out there? Have you experienced like losing a sword in the middle of a scrap? Has the dagger fallen out? Have you got entangled with your lance at some point in time here? I certainly have. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say out there for yourself when it comes down to your training practices and observations within the art of arms. So with that being the case, everybody, until I see you, as always, please stay safe out there, train well, fight on. I'll see you all soon.